Um, I want to do a few things today. I want to finish with a discussion of ritual approaches to Islamic approaches to peacemaking that Abu Nimer mentions in his in the chapter that you were supposed to have read. And then I want to move on to the whole question of Christianity, war and peace, and then from there to Christianity and conflict resolution, and from there to the Mennonite peacemaking, and then to some of the case studies, and we'll start with the moral rearmament case that's mentioned in that has a chapter that you also read. So we'll try to cover that ground today, and we'll conclude with an open discussion on the issues. I want to also have a discussion before we go on. We'll do a little bit more on Islam. We'll have a discussion about that, and then we'll move on. Okay. I think one of the biggest challenges to the issue of ritual approaches to peacemaking is that the rituals are contained within and assume a certain traditional structure to the world, a certain worldview. We touched on this last time when we talked about the ritual or the tradition in Afghanistan of the jirga, and that the jirga is very, very old. You mentioned in class that you feel it predates Islam, that it's very ancient. I have no doubts about that, and which also raises another issue about ritual, and that ritual is often a confluence of religion and culture, a bringing together of religion and culture, which in many ways is an advantage. It makes it even more powerful, because religion is something that people are more or less pious at various points in history. People are more or less cultural at various points, but when you combine the two, there's a resonance with people's memories and historical memories and what's familiar to them that's very, very potent. But the challenge of ritual, culture, and religion is that for some people it's a liberation, because it frees them up to be fully realized in terms of their ethnic or religious identity. But for others it's a prison. It all depends on what advantages or disadvantages that ritual and culture bring to that person in the process. Okay? Now, rituals and traditional rituals in general, and Abu Nimer touches on this about the differences of, is that a ritual is already a community-based process. It's not the same as, let's put it this way. Remember last time we tried to make a distinction between cultural conflict resolution and elicitive conflict resolution? Well, let's think about it. We were thinking about it from the point of view of the outside intervener. Say the outside intervener wanted to elicit what was indigenous from a certain culture, what's native to the culture. So that would be great for him, because he's being elicitive. But if they say, or certain representatives say, this is how we do it here, that's not being particularly elicitive to the people who are involved in the conflict. It's saying to them, this is the way it is. That's it. You see, it's not elicitive if you're a participant, because cultures are very rigid, or they can be very rigid. So there is some sort of logical distinction here between a pure elicitive method, which would be, an intervener comes to a remote region, and there are people fighting on all sides, and it's chaos, and they just get together in the people in the room who are fighting. They elicit from these people what they want to do, how they see the conflict, how they see the resolution, how they see a process that they could agree to on that resolution. That's pure elicitive. It's not the same as saying, well, we're going to call the local religious leader and the local cultural leaders, and we're going to ask them, how are things done here? because that already could be imposed, and maybe those two groups don't want that. And this is very tricky because most of the places in the world today are not pure traditional spaces. There's hardly any traditional spaces left. There are traditionalists, and then there are people in the military who consider themselves secular, or there are people who are more pious and less pious, and which ones have the guns, and which ones don't. Which businessmen involved, are they interested in a traditional process or not? I think, and then of course there are the gender issues, where very often, maybe most of the time, if women have a choice, they don't want the traditional method. If they have one step out of the culture or one leg out, they feel that the traditional approaches, which always were controlled by men, would not be to their advantage. Unless, of course, the secular thing that's been set up is far more corrupt and worthless anyways, and maybe they would want the cultural method. See what I'm saying? It would depend on the circumstances. But it's not there's no automaticity to the fact today that an elicitive approach is going to yield a cultural approach. That's what I'm trying to say. There's no guarantee in any place in the world, including, all sorts of places. Let's say, let's pull out of the rest of the world for a minute and go to a Native American tribe in Arizona. There's no guarantee that an elicitive approach is going to guarantee a cultural approach, because you may be dealing with people who feel that the cultural approach is going to prejudice in favor of one group who are in control, for all the reasons that cultural approaches can be weak. One of the biggest problems with cultural approaches and religious approaches to conflict resolution is that they're often missing the balance of powers and fundamental skepticism that's involved in a modern approach to governance. A modern democratic approach to governance has a libertarian element to it that says that governance is a necessary evil. That it would be better if people could take care of themselves, a little bit anarchistic, and saying that given that reality, what we need is a balance of powers. We need an independent judge, we need an independent police, we need an independent president, an independent Congress, and they're all going to sort of watch each other, right? And that balancing of powers is something that's supposed to make it, roughly speaking, less corruptible. Now, you and I know that that doesn't work often, and throughout history people have tried to balance powers and it doesn't work so well. But in a lot of traditional places, there's very little in the way of a balance of power. Basically, if there's one traditional person in town who is the resident authority, and there's one very wealthy businessman, you can be darn sure that wealthy cleric, that traditional cleric, is not going to necessarily go up against the person who's feeding everybody. Where's the check and balance? There's no check and balance. You see what I'm saying? There's no way to deal with a power structure when there's no checks and balances. So if you're a woman, or you're an outcast in some other fashion, then the whole culture is against you from the get-go. So if your car runs into somebody else, and you're an outcast and they're a traditionalist, what's going to happen to the cultural process? Where the cultural process already assumes that you're a condemned person. It's very different than an independent court that just looks at the case of the car accident. So there are a lot of strengths to a deep cultural approach, and there's a lot of weaknesses. I just mentioned the weaknesses. A strength is that very often there's a time-tested quality. I don't know how to put it another way. There's a time-tested quality to culture and peacemaking and reconciliation that doesn't exist for these more abstract modern approaches to justice. And what I mean by time-tested is that there's a lot of experience for how to get people from a place of anger, rage, and violence to a place of reconciliation. And a lot of that involves a bit of an imposition on people's liberty to sort of persuade them as a culture and as a community to go through a process that they don't necessarily have a whole lot of choice about, that persuades them to reconcile. Now, it's not necessarily unjust. It can be a process whereby. Let me give you an example. We're staying in the abstract, but I hope you've read, because if you haven't read, this is all going to sound like gibberish. If you've read, it's just I'm helping clarify it. That's the balance. That's the nature of the course, is that you have to do the readings. So let's take an example. Somebody's driving down a road in a traditional society, say in the Middle East, and their car swerves. Maybe they were drinking a little. They're not supposed to drink. They were drinking a little, and they hit a child. Child survives, but has a lot of medical bills, and the family is just enraged because it was neglectful, and maybe there was some drinking involved. So they want to go and beat up the guy that did this, but instead, the cultural authorities step in and have the families negotiate. So part of that process might be to negotiate over compensation. It's not like there isn't any justice in the situation. But what the traditional method understands is that it's not just about money. It is about money, but it's not just about money. It's also about rage, and about injury, and about woundedness. So the traditional process will have both a negotiation over funds and also a way to mediate or modulate the sense of rage, sometimes the sense of dishonor. And Abu Nimer has a few examples that he mentions, like, for example, that one solution in a particular place in Gaza, in the Galilee, was for an older man to go around the town for 2 days without his keffiyeh on, which is a formal headdress, a very honored headdress, very cherished headdress in the Palestinian community. And that's a big dishonor for an older person. So what did the dishonor do? Well, it neutralized the rage. It wasn't death. It wasn't permanent destruction of his body. It was 2 days of humiliation. Subtle form of humiliation. He wasn't set up on a post and beaten. It wasn't disgusting, but it was, in an honorable society, an act of dishonor, which is a very interesting thing for us to unpack also about the honorable societies and the unhonorable societies. And I don't mean that to criticize the United States or other places, but cosmopolitan societies that have many immigrants, like the United States, there's no common code of honor. Honor is something, again, that's time tested. It requires a certain environment. So it's harder to punish people based on honor and dishonor. What's astonishing to people outside the United States from Japan and other places is how many people stay in office even after they've been dishonored. There's no shame. There's no sense of shame. And that sense of shame or not shame is actually an important lever in how people reconcile, because it gives you a little bit of leg room as to how you're going to feel like justice has been served. If there isn't a code of honor, then the only thing you can do is take somebody's money and lock them up. Those are the two things you can do, is prison and lockup. Prison and financial compensation. There's a lot of complaints from different approaches to justice. There's a whole different approach to justice called, why is that? Not distributive justice, that is distributive justice. What's the other kind called? Restorative justice, sorry. And one of the other complaints about the more abstract modern approach to justice, or distributive justice, is that it disempowers the people who are the victims. They don't have a right to speak. Their testimony is often not important. One of the things it's astonishing when you get into genocide investigations, like, for example, in World War II and Nuremberg and all these places, the victims had absolutely no voice. It was astonishing. The only thing that was important was forensic evidence, and so the Nazi files were more trustworthy than the voice of a victim. Now, a legal scholar can justify that. I understand that. But if you look at it in terms of healing and cycles of violence, it's not exactly helpful that in precisely the moment in which you could have a reconciliation due to empowering, or re-empowering a victim, that they are silenced even more. And we know this in terms of violence against women also in the United States and elsewhere. So these are all the reasons why a cultural process that's far more focused on restorative justice and restoring the community, restoring the balance of the community, is a whole area of investigation in conflict analysis and resolution that's yielded a lot of interesting results around the world. The disadvantage, or the challenge, is that not everybody's going to buy into that anymore, at all. Not only because there are traditional outgroups, whether it be women or other outcasts or people who aren't, we're all mixed. There are no pure traditional environments, really very, very few. Even, you know, you go to the places in the United States and you see a really fundamentalist community. But at the end of the day, when they call 911, they don't have their own 911. They don't have, like, dial F911, fundamentalist 911. They don't. Because I shouldn't suggest it. Maybe they'll come up with that. So they don't dial F911. They dial 911. So suddenly, as soon as they dial 911, they're inside a different world that guarantees safety and security, or at least is supposed to guarantee safety and security. Which means they're already operating in two universes. So their own notions of justice and restoration would not be pure in that instance. I happen to, it wasn't in this class, it was in my class last year, that we had a wonderful time, which we should get to. I'm going to, when I get to the Menno case, remind me to talk about what happened in the school last year, the school that was all the school kids that were shot in Pennsylvania in the Amish community, and we'll raise that over there, because that's also an instance of what I'm saying about this intersection between different forms of conflict resolution. So what all this has to do with Islam is that Islam operates in many, many places in the world in which traditional cultures are still dominant. The environment is not pure, but they're still dominant. So it provides an interesting opportunity to see whether in interventions these cultural approaches and religious approaches can be drawn upon. Now, look at the language, and you'll see this in Abu Nimer and others. None of us are really being quite, no, I wouldn't say it that way. We don't know how, it's not easy to handle this. Because if you notice the language, look at the way I framed that. I didn't frame that like, well, if religion is dominant in, I don't know, in Iran, and in a province of Iran, we have the Sharia and we have a traditional system to deal with conflict. I didn't say that. I said that there are traditional societies, and this is a possibility to be drawn upon as you enter into a situation. Because I wasn't prepared. Remember we talked about prejudice last week and about what my vantage point is, that I wasn't prepared to say, well, I think wherever African religions rule, there should be African conflict resolution only. And I think where Islam rules in Iran and other places, there should be only, Shiite Islamic conflict resolution in that particular village. I didn't say that. Because I'm not ready to say that everybody in that environment would want me to reinforce that closed cultural structure. I'm not ready to say that. I'm not ready to say, for example, that if I had, let's stay away from Iran for a minute, or some more fluid situation like, I don't know, I'm a nonprofit in Lebanon, and I'm doing peacemaking in Lebanon, and there's a big fight in a village, and it is a Shiite village, and there's a woman in great distress, and she's fighting against everybody in the community. She wants a divorce, and she can't get one, and so on and so forth. And I come into that situation and I'm trying to be helpful in some fashion. So I'm not prepared to say that if I came into that situation, I would say, well, you know, most of the community here wants you to submit to a cultural approach to this and a religious approach to this. It means you have to consult with the religious authorities and see what they say. Because she's still living in Lebanon and she may want to try to access a system of law that goes beyond the traditional constructs of her particular village. So is it my job to force her to stay? Is it my job to stoutly defend her and come in and help mess things up even more? Is my job to make some sort of compromise? I don't know. Again, coming back to what we talked about in the last few weeks, these are moral choices. They look like conflict resolution choices, but they're also moral choices. How heavily do you weigh the right of one woman to go up against the system versus an established system of conflict prevention and conflict resolution of a particular culture, where she would have far less of a voice? You could, give me arguments both ways. Even from a try to stick within the conflict resolution language for those of you who know the field. What would be an argument for? Well, the argument for siding with. No, somebody give me an argument for siding with the powers that be and the culture in that situation, and not taking up the cause of the woman and making her an international celebrity of a victim of oppression and so forth. What would be the argument to not defend her from a conflict resolution perspective?
For the cultural side.
Yeah. What would be an argument not to defend her?
But it's going to have the backing of the community. It's going to be what's accepted in that particular area.
So what?
Well, the community is going to be a part of that conflict, and
Yeah.
unless they're involved in that, in the resolution of that conflict, it won't address the root cause.
So what are you setting up as your goal? What's your goal in that case? Why would you side with the community? Why does that fulfill your goals? What are your goals? See, there are goal assumptions or values assumptions, but they're assumptions. What are your assumptions of what your goals are to side with the community in that case?
Again,
I think to piggyback on yours, at a most basic level, if we're going to side with the greater society at large, whenever we go into a conflict to try to resolve it, our hope is that we don't actually exacerbate.
Okay.
We do no harm, if you want to use that simplistic kind of mantra. And by siding with the community, you're going in, yes, the minority, i.e. the woman, is maybe not getting what she would want out of the conflict, other than that it has to be determined, but you're not actually creating more of a conflict.
So your conflict resolution goal is the preservation of harmony or the restoration of harmony. And that if this person's individual has to be sacrificed for that, it's more important to keep the peace. It's peacekeeping, basically. Because you know that if you defy the whole will of the community because of one person, then there's probably going to be an eruption of violence. And you're going to be the cause of it by coming in as an outside powerful force of some sort, and you're upsetting the apple cart. So there's a choice there. What would be an argument? Did you have your hand raised? Did somebody? Oh, you did. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, it would not be beneficial to the woman either, because if she continues to live in that society, and if we take the side of the woman, she will be ostracized once we leave. So if it is a society, a woman who gets a divorce can't buy a house and live on her own.
Right.
So unless we plan on taking her with us, it's not good for the woman in the long run.
Okay. Now.
To turn the society that she lives in.
That's a great
argument
argument.
Against her.
So let me push back. It's a great argument. Let me push back and say, you're making an assumption now that when the woman wants you to come in on her side, she's not seeing the total picture because she's very angry right now. So right now she just wants to fight. But in the long run, you may not even be serving her interests, because she could turn around in 2 years and say, why did you come in? Now I have nobody, and I may have won the case, or I may have gotten attention, but I lost my whole life, right? Okay. That's a very interesting argument. Very interesting argument. This is the kind of parsing out of things morally that never go on in NGOs. They hardly ever go on. They go on when people get upset. They certainly don't go on in agencies, in federal agencies, that make these big decisions. And yet, this kind of what I would call situational ethics, of parsing out the real consequences for people and thinking things through, it really can only be done in group form. I mean, for all of my experience, which isn't a whole lot, but it's more than some of you and my age, I never would have thought of your argument at this moment. I would have learned very quickly if I had seen it in process, but I am very flexible in the moment of immediately seeing where things are going wrong. But I never would have thought of that in advance. And that's why it's so important to talk these things through with a large group of people, and not who you trust, and who have a good track record, and not allow your brain to make ideological choices. Platonic ideological choices. Basically what we're doing is a kind of moral inductive reasoning. I could say, in a Platonic way, no, the first and most important principle here are the rights of a woman. But an inductive approach would say, well, let's ask, what's going on here? What are the different possibilities? And suddenly you realize that even for that woman it may be a bad idea. Certainly, maybe it's good to support her quietly, but if you make a federal case out of it and you put her on the news, it could really be a disaster because you've humiliated the leadership. And maybe there would be a third way. We don't know. Maybe there would be a third way to both support her but not do it in a way that would humiliate the authorities. So all of these are possibilities if you're very careful, if you're inductive, and you're open as an intervener to the gray areas of moral reasoning. The gray areas of moral reasoning. This is also the distinction between just being hard-nosed about interventions without any cultural interest, or conversely, interventions purely on the principles of say, the rights of a woman. Now, let me give you an argument for why coming in on the side of the woman strongly is actually conforming to the higher goals of conflict resolution. Because people would say that it looks like you're going to keep the peace more by giving in to the will of the community against the woman. But what you're forgetting is the structural violence inherent in the situation. That structurally speaking, it's not just her, it's all the women in the group. Or it's all the people who are traditional outcasts, or traditionally not empowered to speak or make choices. So what you're doing is just maintaining a system of oppression. It looks more peaceful, but you're actually perpetuating quiet forms of violence. And that would be a reason to say, no, I'm not going to be just silent. These are the kind of dilemmas that you'll face. So as attractive as traditional forms of peacemaking are, they also have to be treated very delicately. What are you actually doing by supporting them or by ignoring them? Yeah.
Could you give a real life example of an instance where an NGO did it wrong, and or a federal agency, in an instance, if you know one, where they've done it right?
Yeah. That's a tall order.
Or could you just make one up?
I can make one up.
That would fit both.
Yeah.
Both requests.
Well, there are things that happen in development work all the time that are. If you look at human relationships as like environmental ecosystems, with which they are in certain ways. In other words, there are delicate balances in human relationships. That the best way to understand the dangers of intervention is to understand the same logic in terms of ecosystems. Every time you make a change in an ecosystem, there are unforeseen consequences, right? And that's one of the basics of environmental work. So everything you change, there's something else that changes somewhere else. So the internet is a massive change in human relations. And one of the things that made it impossible for women to become empowered, and well, everybody knew lessons around